Just want to say thank you for your prayers. I think Paul and I feel deeply the richness of what Scripture talks about, the fragrant aroma before the throne of God. Our lives, as you will hear in my story, have touched a lot of different areas very broadly. So there are lots and lots. There's a lot I do not understand about prayer. I'll be the first to tell you. But the Lord asks us to ask. And it does matter that we are praying for each other. And if I am fully confident that God has plenty of aroma to act if he so chooses. So, thank you. Let me just start there. And I'm assuming there's a 99%, but I'll just get the elephant out of the room. I've got metastatic ocular melanoma, which is an eye cancer that was diagnosed 3 years ago. The expectation was that within 2 years, from all that we know about it, I would get metastasis. And sure enough, November of this last year, we found a metastasis, and we've been aggressively trying things. In simple terms, we've gone through 2 full treatments, out-of-the-box treatments, believe me. And they both failed. Unless the Lord steps in, I will probably have that's my nephew, don't worry about him. I should have a tombstone that probably will be dated 2017. But the Lord could step in, and we know that, but he has not said anything otherwise. I am, as Paula will say, I'm a storyteller. And so I'm only going to give you touch points. And every one of those has a story, but we don't have time for them. In fact, for the kids, I have actually made a list of 36 stories. And I've been working on recording these stories for the family. But anyway, let me kind of go through the summary, which will probably take half the time. And then I'm going to give you some touch points of where does a guy sit today who has been following the Lord for a long time. And what do I think would be something that you could take home from where I'm at? So that's where I'm going. So to keep me on track, I've made a list. I'm a preacher's kid at age 6. My dad, he had a church that at that point was all 30 or 40 people sitting in that downstairs. When I see the pictures, it's a lot smaller than what I remember as a kid. But it was, it may have been 50 people. But it happened. Mom remembers this better than I do, which parents do at this early age. I remember Dad saying it happened to be a Christmas Eve service, and he just offered again an invitation. And I remember thinking, well, I've never done that. So my parents both came out of some pretty difficult backgrounds, so the reality of Christ was very real in their lives, so it was very easy for me as their kid to see the reality of Christ and accept it based on them. And so I think they talked to me, and I must have gone, I don't remember much about it. The one that, the touch point, the next one, is at age 8 in this very small church was a missions week. And they had a speaker from the Evangelical Alliance Mission, Don Hillis, who was a China missionary. He had a brother named Dick Hillis, and they had been missionaries in China. And he got up, and that last night of the missions conference, remember, only 50 people. So I was at the front of the row, sitting up there, and he talked from Romans 12:1 and 2 about giving your body to the Lord, giving your life to the Lord. And I thought, well, I can do that. So I stood up and gave my life to the Lord, and then I had, at the young age of 8, decide how I was going to do a ministry for God. And I looked at what Dad did and said, that's too hard. But one of the early founders of this little church was a resident in surgery at Tulane University, peers of my parents. And he was going to be a missionary doctor in Africa, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do what Gordon does, because that's going to be easier than what Dad did. After Trinidad, I was right at the age of 8 when I had to become a pastor in Trinidad. So, since age 8, I was going to be a missionary doctor. One of the most important mistakes my dad ever made was at age 12. At age 12, we had a faith promise program, which my dad's goal was that church would give at least total giving. So he wanted, even if you gave personally to missionaries, he wanted you to do it through the church so he could measure your giving to the missions. And so his goal was that the congregation of believers would give at least 50% to foreign missions. He never got there. The more they gave to missions, the more. But one of their programs was the Faith Promise program. And some of you may or may not familiarize it because it's 30 years old, 40, I don't know. But it was something you committed to the Lord only if the Lord provided. You were not committed to that amount if the Lord didn't do something over and above what you could currently see. And so I've been involved in that since 8, probably. Well, at age 12, I remember, I think it was $1 a week. Well, it was supposed to be anonymous, right? Well, I had done some Halloween trick-or-treating, and somebody must have seen who I was or threw money in the thing. And I came out with some money, and I thought, oh, cool. So I'm sitting there with my dad and pulling out money instead of candy, and I said, oh, this is going to be Faith Promise money. And he couldn't help himself. And he said, so how much did you put in there? And when I said $1 a week, you should have seen his face. Like, oh no, how am I going to prepare him for God not doing this? And it was the best mistake my dad ever made, because all of a sudden I realized, oh, my dad has nothing to do with this. This is me and God. And when God stepped in a few months later, and I was able to do that $52 and more that year, it was me and God. Dad was out of it. And what some of you may have heard Bruce Wilkinson talk about, every generation needs to be a first-generation Christian, because you lose the third generation, because the third generation looks at the second and said, what's this? If the second generation has only based their faith on the first generation, you lose the third generation. Bottom line is, that's when I became a first-generation Christian, because it was now God was answering my prayers, nothing through my parents. So that was age 12. Now we're going to fast forward. One of the things Dad had always said, and I was the compliant kid. Sorry, John. All Dad had to do was look at me, and look at John, and John just stared back. But the reality was, Dad said that if you're going to go into a secular profession, you should have at least a year of Bible before you do that. Oh, okay. So bottom line, fast forward, is Dad, after my graduation from Memphis, Central High in Memphis, Tennessee, with a good Southern accent, he took a position at Multnomah School of the Bible. We were in Memphis. And I thought, well, if it's good enough for Dad, then I won't go to Southeastern Bible College. I'll just go with my parents. And so off I trekked to Multnomah, came here to Portland, and had a year of Bible and theology. Well, once I had that, and I was growing like a weed with all that Christian influence, I thought, well, I would love to do my pre-med at a Christian school, and so that's why I ended up at Biola. Not that they were really getting people into medical school at the time, but I didn't know that, and I didn't care. But I was there for 3.5 years, and I did get into medical school, and to my mom's answered prayer, it wasn't Loma Linda, and it wasn't Tulane University. It ended up where I got to come to Oregon Health Sciences University here. So I was now back home, and I got to be here for 4 years. Well, at the time we were at Biola, I got to go on a missions trip with the Student Missionary Union, and I was in some leadership there, and I got to interview all the students. This was the year before coming up here, and I met this young lady named Paula Geminer, and after a year, after our first year, she was finishing up at Biola, and I was finishing my first year, we got married. So that was one of the greatest blessings for me. So, without getting into any long story, it's I don't know if you know that how people get into residency programs at a medical school. You sign a contract with a computer. You put in all your choices of where you want to go that you've interviewed, and they put in all their interviewees by their choices, and you promise that whatever spits out this computer, that's where you go. Well, she thought she wanted to go to Seattle, but I knew I'd never get into that program. But I really wanted to go to San Antonio, Texas, because I thought that program was real cool. But then the third choice was, well, I had to look at the program closest now to my in-laws who lived in Palm Springs. And guess what? We ended up going to Loma Linda, right outside of, if you're familiar with LA area, you go straight east, you end up out there in the Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino, Loma Linda, and Redlands, where we've lived since then. But that's where the computer spit it out. Lord's direction. We obviously were heavily involved in a church here during our 3 years together, and got into ministry. That's just what we do. And we're looking for a church there, and we ended up, through some strange direction, the Lord plopped us in a brand new church plan, been around for about a year, from Campus Crusade for Christ was up the hill there, MAF was in Redlands, so these were home missionaries that started this church about a year and a half before we arrived. It's about 125 people, and 25 of them were high school kids. And so we began throwing ourselves into ministry in that, which has been a part of our lives essentially ever since then. And we, in that church, continue to throw ourselves into ministry. I think the pastor got us involved in 2 weeks into the youth ministry. Of course, I was in my residency. I think there were some people, even in this small church, that when she got pregnant, they weren't sure she was married. They didn't see her connected to me. So, I mean, it was that kind of a problem when you're in the middle of your residency. But then we got involved into missions, then we got into the small group leadership, and eventually, over the years, I got onto the elder board. And this church continued to grow. And it became very apparent that once after my 5-year residency, that this should be, if the Lord's going to send us overseas, that this should be our sending church. And so we, by God's grace, got a position at Kaiser Fontana, one of the original Kaisers down there. And then we began slowly waiting on the Lord. Where are we going? How are you going to get us there? And believe me, there are lots of long stories on that. But to say it in simple terms, the missions committee desired to do a church plant using all the professionals. The church was a very, very high professional church. Lots of chiefs of surgery and stuff from Loma Linda, lots of people in a high, very professional class. And bottom line is through a number of things, we ended up going to Trinidad with a 2-year-old, 4-year-old, 6-year-old, and an 8-year-old. And the goal was to start a church among the professional class. Much to my lack of skills, I'm very happy that it's English speaking. Mm-hmm. So even at teams evaluation of language skills, I was not that high. Paula was quite high. But we were there for 10 years. Again, I'm hitting touch points. Again, you can only imagine the amount of stories that are there. But some very early hard years. And everything that you may or may not know about missions, but our sin nature continues to be with us as we work with other missionaries, and probably the hardest thing about missions is other missionaries. And we experienced all of those stories. We could write the books on those stories, but the Lord was very gracious. I was there as a support for a church planter. I had a position at the University of the West Indies teaching residents and medical students, but I was to be the support. After 2 years, he left and the whole thing was in my lap. So, as I knew at age 8, being a pastor was not very easy. I was right. So, but God was gracious, and after 10 years, we saw some real fruit, and were able to turn this over to a Trinidadian pastor. The Evangelical Alliance Mission, whom we went under, if you remember the story, that was Don Hillis, who at age 8, it was his mission as well. That at age 8 that I decided to be a missionary doctor. They began looking at me at leadership positions, and we really did think that I was going to leave medicine for a while there. But they passed me by twice, which is fine. I'm one of these guys that doesn't hurt my feelings if I'm not the right guy. You want the right person in the right position. The third time around, it was like, we've been there, done that. And the Lord opened a door for me. We were back at Redlands with our church. Again, throwing ourselves back into ministry. There was a church plant that they were doing up into the not high desert, but up about 15 minutes, 20 minutes up into the desert area up in Beaumont and Banning, and we jumped at it. It was a good ministry opportunity. That was our heart. So we drove past the home church for about 5 years as we got involved in ministry there. But the Lord opened the door for me to join Kaiser Riverside, and eventually, after a few years, actually became chief of surgery down there. Fast forward, that's now been about 11 years that we've been involved down there. During that period of time, I know we've been up here seeing you guys periodically when we see Mom. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with ocular melanoma, and I've already kind of given you the fast forward on that. It's been a tough 10 months. Both of these treatments have really done a number on my body. I do not have a functioning pituitary gland, so anything that the pituitary gland is supposed to control, we have to. So I can no longer do those pill boxes because there's too many pills. I have to do baggies. So every Monday morning, I lay out the week's baggies. I wrote on them Monday. I mean, for those of you who've got a lot of pills, all of a sudden I'm there. And so every morning I have to separate the AMs and the PMs, and so that's kind of my life right now. But we're at a point now where, going through any kind of treatment, it's not like I'm against some systemic treatment. The goal of cancer treatment right now, it's a huge wave. Next 5 to 10 years is going to be pretty amazing. But the goal is to train your body to fight the cancer itself. And what that means is, the reason I can't give you my cancer is because it's not you. Anything I give you, you'll just laugh and kill it. Well, unfortunately, my cancer cells are me. And unless we can trick them to think it's not me, if they do, then they'll take care of it by itself. All of those things have failed at this point. I literally have got hair for the first time in about a week and a half. That's new. I can show you pictures where I do not recognize myself. So it's been recently, the last treatment's been pretty rough. What are some of the things that you could take away that I could give you? One of them is I'm hoping, I've got a lot of ideas and plans. You can tell that I just can't stop moving. I think Paula's been on whiplash for the last 3 weeks because all of a sudden I'm back. She's just been kind of taking care of me, and all of a sudden I'm ready to run and everything else. And so it's been a little whiplash for her. But one of the things that I'm trying to do for the family is tell the stories of what I call my Ebenezer's. Look at what God has done. Those things that if you go back to 1 Samuel 2:7, 7:2 or something like that, 7:2, where the Israelites put up the memorials and they could look back and say, okay, look what God did. And I've got tons of those. And so I'm not only trying to tell the stories, but I'm actually trying to make a book of those for the kids they kind of have a picture reference and a little bit of stories for them. And my encouragement to you is to be able to go back and say, hey, what are your Ebenezer's? What are those things that you could say? Because there are tough times. And when you're able to go back and say, well, just because God was so good at that time, just because it's tough now, I mean, come on. Are you going to accept the good as well as the bad? Sounds a little Job-like, right? Yeah. The reality is you do, because he's still the same God at the same time. The other thing that's been very something that I have chewed on a lot, one of the things I didn't tell you about is in the middle of this treatment, 2 years ago, I was made chairman of the elder board. This was 1 month after this church, now from 125, had grown to 1,500, had slowly depreciated over the last 5 years down to the 950s. Our 21-year service pastor had retired. The elders had brought in, within a year, a potential candidate and a budget and renewal of 3 godly elders. On that meeting, only one thing passed: the budget. They kicked out the elders. They refused to take this thing, and a month later, this was an implosion, guys. There was total lack of trust among the elder board, what was going on, where the direction of the church was, and 1 month later, while I'm in the middle, this is only 2 years ago, they made me chairman of the elder board. It was something that we knew that this was what God called us to do. And it's been quite a journey to build the trust, to see God work in this kind of a tough situation. Why am I getting to this? Because God has given us each gifts and talents. I may have been given 7. I always think that I'm an overachiever. He gave me 5, but I've been working on 7. And that has its own problems, okay? But you need to be faithful for what he's given you to do. And if you're faithful for what God has given you to do, we all hear the same thing. What is that? Well done. That's all we want to hear. And my encouragement to you is, what are the talents that he's given you, and are you being faithful for the talents that he's given you? That's all he's asking. So you can only imagine, after now having a new pastor there, the church is thriving. In fact, it was thriving before, thank goodness we got the new pastor there. And God was doing some marvelous things. And of course, I'm getting lots of accolades from a lot of people. But the reality also, what do I feel? It's no different than if you were called during that time to stay in this church, which a lot of people left, stay in this church and be faithful for what he did to do in that Sunday school class. It's no different, because you were faithful for what God called you to do. And to me, that's all I was doing. I think my life verse is in 2 Peter 1:3. God has given us all that we need for life and godliness in Christ Jesus. That's it. He's given me all. And no matter what the circumstances, he's given me what I need. And that's been the foundation for me. A lot of people, Paul and I have talked about this, but a lot of times people say, well, and I can understand it, being in your shoes for when I wasn't here. I can't go through or do as well as you are doing through this situation. And it's like, it took me a while to because I understood what people were saying. It's not that they wasn't real, but I think what the difference is I have the grace. You don't. So as you look at what I'm going through, do you have the grace to go through what I'm going through? Of course not, because you're not going through it. You're not given grace ahead of time. You're not given. But God's going to be faithful to give you the grace that you need when he hands you what he hands you. And that's what he's doing. He's handed me this And my question has always been, or my statement has always been, no one should die better than a believer. No one. Why? Because we have that hope which nobody else has. And so that's, if you want to know what my ultimate goal right now is, if God's called me home, to do this well. To do this well. I have to admit, he's given me a few little extras on this, I think, because my pragmatic nature. I mean, I've gone through a whole lot, and there are days when I literally could barely get out of bed and lay down in our family room, and that's what I did for the day. And there have been times I thought, okay, I bet you can get just as much glory out of this day as me standing up in front of the congregation and lead. I mean, literally, if this is what you called me today, can I be faithful today for what you called me to do? And I think my pragmatic nature really helps, because I just try to get it done. Whatever it takes to get through that day, I just get through that day. So it's been very helpful. And I think the other thing that has helped me the most is a huge sense of gratitude. We see this in Scripture all the time, but I feel like it's more of a gift and there's probably some learning to it, but I've never felt entitled, and I thank my parents for that. I've never felt entitled, and there's a huge sense of gratitude for what I can look back and say, I have no regrets. I mean, there are things I've screwed up royally. I mean, just ask my kids. They're not here, thank goodness. You know, of all the things that I've probably done the worst and the poorest is actually, with all of my aggressiveness, I have probably done the worst in raising my kids. If I was to measure, these two are doing a great job. Okay. But God's grace stepped into that too. And I got 4 great kids, got great spouses who love the Lord, despite of me. Okay. And there's just a huge sense of gratitude for all that God has done. And so those are little take-homes for where I'm at and what God's doing. And just really appreciative. One of my things I've always said, I've always wanted to be able to be turned on a dime. God says turn. I can't remember the book, and it kind of early on said you should try to visualize how you want to run your life. And the analogy that came to me is I should have been a road rally racer. Now, don't talk to them about how I drive. Trinidadians thought they taught me. I just learned new stuff when I got there. But it's the fact that what I love about the whole concept of a road rally, it's a road you've really never been on, and that turn, you really don't know what's around it, but I want to hit it as hard and as fast as I can and just be able to gun it through and keep moving. Well, that's obviously the personality the Lord's given me, but it's that sense of, if he says, and I remember when the diagnosis came, and it's like, okay, things are clear. It's not an unclear situation. This is a clear situation. And obviously, that's how I've been able to move forward. So, thank you for your prayers. It's quite a journey. And obviously, the story has not been completed. But I'll continue to try to be faithful for what he's called. Thank you.